Morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Abby Lester, and I'm the director of the JDC Global Archives. And welcome to today's book talk with Dr. Rachel Deblinger in recognition of Jewish American Heritage Month. Before we start today's program, I'd like to share a few words about the archives. We hold the organizational history of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC or the Joint. Our collections include millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of photographs, hundreds of artifacts, as well as audio, video, and film recordings dating back to the founding of the organization in 1914. Given the role that JDC has played in Jewish lives around the world since that date, our archives reflect not only the history of the organization, but also the history of world Jewry in the 20th and 21st centuries. Operating out of both New York and Jerusalem, visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, genealogists, curators, filmmakers, and so on. A big part of what makes our collection so accessible is that much of the material has been digitized and is publicly available online. This allows a broad international audience to explore and use the archives from wherever they are. To support scholarly research in our collections, we also offer fellowships funded by generous donors. Our speaker today, Rachel Deblinger, is the director of the Modern Endangered Archives program at the UCLA Library. It's a granting program that funds the digitization and preservation of at-risk cultural heritage materials from around the world. She holds a PhD from UCLA and remains a member of the UCLA Holocaust Research Lab. Rachel is a contributor to the book Ethics of the Algorithm, Digital Humanities and Holocaust Memory, and she is the author of the book about which she will present today, Saving Our Survivors, How American Jews Learned About the Holocaust. Rachel will present for about 35 minutes, followed by 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. Please note, as usual, your microphones are turned off and we will take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the program. Rachel will now start her presentation.
Hi, everyone. I just want to start by thanking Isabel for inviting me to participate in this webinar and helping connect me with the JDC audience, and also to thank Abra and Abby for their organization of the webinar. Also want to thank Misha Mitzel, who helped me all the way back in 2011 when I was first starting this work to navigate the microfilm rolls before all of this amazing material was available online. And more recently for his help to ensure that the images from the JDC archive ended up in the book, Saving Our Survivors. I am really grateful to have this opportunity to share this book with JDC, with all of you, and to recognize the role that JDC played not only in my own research, but also in providing humanitarian aid to survivors in the wake of the Holocaust, and as I'll discuss right now, in connecting American Jews to the stories of those survivors. So, Saving Our Survivors explores a broad range of post-war Holocaust representation. I look at Jewish communal organizations, JDC, among many others, that shaped and disseminated images and stories about Holocaust survivors across a range of media materials to mobilize a humanitarian and philanthropic response at the start of World War II. At the end of World War II. I focus particularly on the period 1945 to 1953, after which most displaced persons camps in Europe were closed and American Jewish communal aid largely shifted to Israel. The book illustrates how American Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors first encountered stories about Jewish survivors of Nazism during this liminal period, when American Jews responded to the changing boundaries of Jewish life, global politics of the emerging Cold War, and shifting cultural norms in post-war America. The book illustrates this set of questions that kind of informed my research. So first, how did institutions and communal organizations that aided Jewish survivors craft narratives about the Holocaust? What kinds of stories did American Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors first encounter about the Holocaust? And more broadly, how have narratives about the Holocaust, particularly those expressed by survivors, changed over time? So these questions are really kind of at the institutional scale, not necessarily at the individual scale, but One of my goals is that this work can really help us toggle between several different scales. So one is between institutions and individuals. Another one is between the specificity of the post-war and a much longer history of Holocaust memory in America. One that traces how knowledge about the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors have been and continues to be shaped, mediated, and defined. But I want to start with the post-war period, when American Jews and Jews around the world were, according to Gisela Wizamsky and Lola Komarsky, in a letter to the Hadassah National Youth Aliyah Committee dated July 27, 1945, in a world still trembling with the impacts of evils let loose upon the world by our enemies and the enemies of mankind. In the immediate aftermath of the war, in the spring and summer of 1945, roughly 10 million people were categorized as displaced persons in Europe. The vast majority of the Jews made up only a very, very small percentage of this initial displaced persons community. And as the liberating armies swept through Europe, the vast majority of these 10 million people were repatriated and found their way home. So that by August 1945, again, it's a very short period of time, only 1.5 million DPs remained in occupied territories. A much larger percentage of this DP community were Jewish, as Jews often refused to be repatriated. And so in the years ahead, the number of Jewish DPs actually increased as Jews who had survived the war in hiding or in the Soviet Union made their way west, seeking care or family or community within the displaced persons camps managed by the liberating army. So this population of Jewish DPs in the post-war period shifted over time as some Jews found their way home, some found their way into the displaced persons camps. And it is this kind of evolving group of Jewish survivors who called themselves the Sharit HaPlatah, the surviving remnant, that we hear the stories about in the immediate post-war period. These are the first Jews that American Jewish organizations were engaged or directly engaged with through the kind of institutional spaces of the displaced persons camps and other displaced persons homes and kind of institutional centers across Western Europe. And so I'm starting with these glimpses of DP life and the experiences of Jewish survivors immediately after the war, because I want to really focus on the fact that these narratives, the narratives circulating in post-war America, were specific to the post-war period. They reflected life in DP camps, this liminal space and time when the surviving Jews of Europe were waiting for opportunities to rebuild their lives. These narratives and images often do not look or sound like the survivor narratives that make up so much of contemporary Holocaust memory. They do not look like or sound like the videos and exhibits at Holocaust museums around the world, or the taped testimonies of the Shoah Foundation or the Yale Fortunoff collection. And they are certainly not the types of testimonies that we would see in any of the new AI or computational experiences that are now available at museums and online. Nonetheless, they are important to consider as part of the history of Holocaust memory in America, because they remind us that the Holocaust has taken on different meanings in American Jewish life over the past 7 decades and will continue to do so today and into the future. So, what did these Holocaust narratives look like in the immediate aftermath of the war? Post-war communal narratives were often not clear chronological narratives, although sometimes they are, and we'll kind of follow up on that later. They often did not focus on the details of one individual experience, often not focusing on the details or any part of the experience during the war. Instead, these narratives, images, and voices were captured, shaped, and disseminated to mobilize action and advocacy. They were meant to inspire action in response to the most pressing issues of that time, primarily humanitarian aid in post-war Europe and changing immigration policies to provide pathways for the vast majority of survivors who sought to leave Europe. You can start to see from this image from a JDC annual report in 1948. These are Holocaust survivors. And this image sent to Jewish homes across America, all Jewish donors would have received this annual report. All donors to JDC would have received this annual report, and they were sent to Jewish homes and to kind of celebrate the success of JDC in that year. And this image maybe already challenges some of your assumptions and expectations about Holocaust representation. So first, these survivors are clearly very happy. There is a joy. They are seen here leaving Marseille en route to Israel, and they are excited about that. The second kind of thing I want to point your attention to is that we see a train centered in the middle of the image. And the train is a kind of central Holocaust icon, according to Oren Steer, quote, an icon of modern industrial mass murder. But here, and in many other images from American Jewish communal life in the post-war period, trains are also a method and a tool of freedom. They're a pathway for joy and opportunity. They are taking liberated Jews, they're taking Jewish survivors from Europe to the future. And so there's a kind of fluidness around how we understand, and we really have to understand the symbols and images that were being circulated at this time. And it's often these kinds of narratives, optimistic, forward-looking, that shaped much of post-war narratives about the Holocaust, and it might not be what we expect to see. For the remainder of the talk, I want to introduce you to a range of materials from the late 1940s and 1950s that presented survivors to American Jews, highlighting how they fit into their post-war context and how they motivated a response to the post-war crisis. In particular, I will explore a few key themes. So first, the needs of the 1940s, so food and material goods in particular. Second, the centrality of children in the images and stories that were circulating in post-war America. And third, that these narratives invited American Jews into the story of the Holocaust, really asking for help that could only come from America. And along the way, we will consider how they differ from Holocaust survivor narratives we are more familiar with today. And then finally, I'll end with a kind of long case study of focus on Kurt Meyer and his story and how it was represented for American audiences. So here's a little sneak peek of some materials that were circulating in the late 1940s. We can see here some JDC materials, another annual report, some fundraising brochures for the SOS program, but also materials from other organizations, including Vad Hatzalah, the Union of Orthodox Rabbis Emergency Relief Organization. And hopefully you can start to see some of the themes I just pointed to: children, material aid, and the kind of focus on fundraising. It may not have been your first thought to look for representation of the Holocaust survivors in fundraising materials, but in fact, the urgency of the post-war period meant that Jewish organizations and communal leaders were actively fundraising and using the stories of Jewish survivors to do so. They were using these stories to raise alarm, to kind of call for motivation, to really activate American Jews to the cause of post-war aid for Jewish survivors. But what did that look like? So here's a statement from Dr. Joseph Schwartz, who was the head of European activity for the JDC in the post-war period. And he called on American Jews to act as they never had before, not only to support Jewish survivors, but to ensure that there was a secure Jewish future. So he wrote to the constituents of JDC in July 1945, again, right at the end of the war, quote, "Your relief is not charity anymore. It is a paramount responsibility of the American Jewish community, a common understanding of reconstruction and rehabilitation on which we must set no limit on effort or cost. Only with this approach will we be able to handle the problem in the constructive manner necessary to rebuild the broken Jewish communities in Europe." American Jews were urged to take up the task of securing a future for Europe's Jews. And this is one version. This is the JDC's vision of what Jewish life after the Holocaust would look like, what was needed to rebuild it. We could see from the earlier slide from the Vad Hatzalah brochure that they were focused on a slightly different vision of the Jewish future. How will Judaism survive? And so one of the things that I won't get into in this presentation, but I'm happy to talk about a little bit more in the questions if you're interested, is that different organizations were really trying to use the stories of Holocaust survivors to motivate American Jews to participate in building the future of Jewish life after the Holocaust, after so much destruction. And different Jewish organizations were presenting different visions of what that future would look like, all of which were representing Holocaust survivors within these different frames. American Jews met the demand that Schwartz was calling for. In 1946, the United Jewish Appeal, the umbrella organization that raised funds for the JDC, the United Palestine Appeal, and then the United Israel Appeal, as well as the National Refugee Service, and then the United Service for New Americans, they set an ambitious goal of raising $100 million. To give you a sense of why this was so ambitious at the time, UJA had raised $100 million throughout the entire war. So between 1938 and 1945, the United Jewish Appeal had raised about $100 million. In 1946, they were calling on American Jews to raise that same amount of money in that one year. At the same time, the Red Cross, an organization with a membership of more than 18 million, also set a goal of raising $100 million in 1946. Jewish communal leaders themselves are quoted as saying this goal was ridiculous. And what's incredible is not only did they meet it, but the documented total exceeded the $100 million. The UJA raised $103 million in 1946. In 1947, UJA again exceeded their fundraising goal, raising over $150 million. And totals remained over $200 million throughout the next 5 years, hitting over $250 million in 1948 after the founding of Israel. The campaigns that motivated this extraordinary level of giving explicitly pulled at the heartstrings of American Jewish donors, relying, as I mentioned earlier, on stories and images of survivors. And we can start to see here some of those campaigns, including the Hadassah report, Our Child Survivors, really pulling on American Jews to see these Jewish children as our responsibility as part of our kin. You can also see some letters here. Numerous organizations created pen pal programs that were also fundraising initiatives. Families, organizations, groups would sponsor children, write them letters, send them packages, and then often the children would write letters back. So this is kind of one pathway by which the voices of survivors were reaching American Jewish homes. Rescue Children, a project of Vad Hatzalah, again, the Orthodox organization, supported children's orphans' home with kosher kitchens directly through these kinds of adoption programs, again, kind of drawing their focus and the focus of their constituents and donors on Judaism and the practice of Jewish life, not just on Jewish people. I really, again, want to highlight the post-war focus. For so many of these campaigns, the emotional heft was not necessarily the tragedy of their experience, of Jewish experiences under Nazism, but the ongoing demand for safety, security, and survival. Rabbi Herbert Friedman, who served as a chaplain and then later in his career became a regular speaker for UJA, repeatedly told a story about helping Jews smuggle themselves across the border from Czechoslovakia into Germany to find relief in the DP camps after the Kielce pogrom in 1946. The bomb of a warm drink on the other side of the border, provided by JDC, as told in his story, was the crescendo of his appeal, because it was something that American Jews could do in response to the post-war crisis. The immediate needs for food, for clothes, for medicine, for books, for material goods, these were the demands American Jews could answer, and post-war campaigns invited American Jews to act as saviors, providing aid, hope, love, all of which could only come from America. So you can see here, this is a brochure from the JDC program, Supplies for Overseas Survivors, that American Jews were called on to literally be the lifeline for European Jews. Between 1947 and 1949, SOS collected 26 million pounds of relief goods from nearly 1,000 communities across the country. They sent 14 million pounds of food, 11 million pounds of clothes, 1 million pounds of medicine, and over 170,000 toys, enough for each surviving Jewish child to have at least one. The focus on material goods and the role of America in providing aid echoed across the country beyond the Jewish community. In 1945, President Truman reported from the Potsdam Conference that the U.S. must win the peace after the end of the war. That, quote, if we let Europe go cold and hungry, we may lose some of the foundations of order on which the hope for worldwide peace must rest. So we see this idea, the idea from SOS, echoed more broadly in the United States narratives that were going around to win the peace. And again, in the December 1945 Saturday Evening Post article summed up as "World Relief is America's Job." This example highlights how American Jewish communal organizations were circulating about Holocaust survivors were not dissimilar to the images and narratives circulating more broadly in post-war America, and the sense that it was America's job to donate materials and money to feed and clothe war-torn children of the world was both generic and specific for American Jews. These particular images are from two clothing drive collections that activated the entire country, the first one in April 1944 and the second one in January 1946, and served as early Cold War efforts to send friendship abroad. So again, this is just to highlight that the work that American Jewish communal organizations were doing and the work that American Jews were doing in terms of donating material goods and donating funds was also being replicated at a national level. And so the work that Jews were doing was really echoing across multiple communities and across borders of those communities. I want to hold on to this idea that in this post-war period, winning the peace was tied to material aid, because we're going to come back to that in a minute. But first, there was another set of narratives circulating at the time that I want to point to. These narratives were not focused on fundraising, but on advocacy for immigration, and particularly on immigration reform in the United States. Jewish organizations and American Jews were also advocating for the creation of Israel early in the post-war period, but I'm following a different thread at the moment. For example, the Citizens Committee on Displaced Persons was created in 1946 by the American Jewish Committee and the American Council for Judaism to advocate for suspended immigration quotas and temporary legislation that increased immigration for refugees to the United States. They sent out brochures like this one here, and sponsored numerous radio broadcasts that connected the story of Holocaust survivors to the story of America itself, the promise of America as a haven for the oppressed. So the brochure, this kind of part that I've highlighted in red, says, after the nightmare of Nazism and fascism, after the Holocaust of World War II, we owe it to ourselves and to the world to be the guardians of freedom and peace. So the use of the term Holocaust here with a lowercase h highlights how the term was used at the time. And I keep this slide and this example in every presentation I give about this time period and this work, because I think it's important to offer this example as a takeaway. Our idea that the term Holocaust, the idea of the Holocaust, didn't start until the 1970s or the 1980s is actually inaccurate. What was happening at the time was that there was no one way of talking about the destruction and extermination that Jews had faced under Nazism. But in fact, the term Holocaust, alongside many other terms, and the centrality of the number of 6 million Jews lost, these were kind of central ideas at the time, and they were widely circulated in the discourse in reference to the extermination of Jews under Nazism. The Citizens Committee further tied the fate of Jewish survivors to the promise of America, often calling DPs, displaced persons, delayed pilgrims. And it was not just the Citizens Committee that centered America in the narratives about survivors at this time. So here we can see images of the Statue of Liberty as an icon of freedom, and the idea that Jewish survivors were the pilgrims of our time from a brochure from the National Refugee Service, which eventually merged to become HIAS, which is still around today, and was supported under the umbrella of the United Jewish Appeal at the time. The intersection of these ideas of America as a land of promise, of peace, of respite, and America as a land of plenty echoed across survivor representations across the organizational landscape. We see something similar in this 3-page spread in Life magazine from November 1947. Under the title Orphans Clothed, Life magazine featured images of 2 young Holocaust survivors, Irene Gutman and Charles Caro. Irene and Charles had been brought to New York by Rescue Children, again, this project of Ad Hatzalah, for a 10-day publicity blitz. They were the guests of honors at an annual gala in New Jersey. They were the guests of President Truman in the White House. They were photographed around New York City in a variety of posed scenarios, trying on new clothes, carrying stuffed animals, gazing up at skyscrapers, and grabbing wide-eyed at a magnificent pile of white bread sandwiches. The story of Irene and Charles challenges the idea that no one was paying attention to Holocaust survivors and that no one was talking about it. A Jewish organization flew these young orphans to America, toured them around, secured them a spread in Life magazine, which put their images into homes across America, and they met President Truman. And yet, that doesn't mean that Americans or American Jews were really engaged with the Holocaust or what Jews had experienced under Nazism. The article that accompanied these images included no details about the wartime experiences of Irene or Charles, noting only that, quote, both of Irene's parents were exterminated in a concentration camp. Charles's father was killed and his mother died of starvation. But as the Life reported, the sight of Irene and Charles at daily luncheons and parties has already touched so many hearts that donations to Busy Buddies Inc. have jumped 30%. So there's a really palpable tension in this story, and it highlights the power and what I consider to be the import of these kinds of post-war narratives. That the presence of Irene and Charles in America could spark participation in the adoption program speaks to the interest of American Jews in supporting and donating to help Jewish survivors. We can also see how these narratives minimize the experience of Jewish survivors and instead centered America and the generosity of the donors. There is a way to read this tension that American Jews didn't know and they didn't care about what had happened to them. But I don't think that that's right. I think we can see here that American Jews cared very deeply about supporting and aiding their brethren in Europe, and that American Jews at the time donated for many reasons, just as we do today. I'm happy to talk more about Irene and Charles in the question and answer, but I'm going to move on to one final example about, and a much more in-depth example about Kurt Meyer. And we will see some of these major themes kind of circulating through Mayer's representations and also showcase some of the different media formats that were used to disseminate these stories widely across the country. Between 1946 and 1948, the story of Kurt Meyer was publicly shared at least 3 times that I have been able to find across various archives. These narratives reveal some of the themes I've already introduced: the central story of America, the need for American Jews and Americans to serve as saviors in the post-war, advocacy for immigration reform, and the sense of optimism and freedom in America as a direct contrast to the experiences of Nazism. On April 6, 1947, the United Service for New Americans, also under the fundraising umbrella of the United Jewish Appeal, sponsored a special Passover celebration that aired on the radio as Out of the Wilderness. The broadcast featured 5 survivors of Nazi oppression, including Kurt Meyer, a well-known Czech pianist and survivor of Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Ohrdruf, and Buchenwald. The event's MC, David Timmons, welcomes Meyer to the stage. And I invite you to listen here. Hopefully the technology will work as we've practiced. And in particular, I encourage you to listen for 2 things. One, the accents. What are some of the differences you hear between Timmons and Meyer? And then 2, what kinds of information do we learn about the Holocaust? What kind of story would the listening audience have heard?
You've surely heard of our next guest. His story has been published far and wide in the United States by the same United Service that helped him to come to this country. His name is Kurt Meyer. Once his art was acclaimed, not only in his native land of Czechoslovakia, but throughout the world. Then the Nazis changed that world. The concert hall became the concentration camp. And the Nazis called upon Kurt Meyer to play when they shipped him to that terrible place called Auschwitz. Today, Mr. Meyer is here. He is the lone survivor of 86 persons in his family. Need we mention what his free, clean music means to him today?
Timmons juxtaposes the freedom of America with the oppression of the concentration camps to define America as a haven for Jewish victims of Nazism. Meyer then directly addresses the audience, and I'm going to play a clip of Meyer and his performance of My Yiddish Mama. But before I do, I want to note that in addition to playing My Yiddish Mama, Meyer also played 2 other songs, including Ich hab kein Heimatland, I have no homeland, of which he notes, quote, "We have sung it in the darkest hours in the various concentration camps for all of those who went through the Nazi terror." So thinking again about terminology and how survivors might have described their own experiences with multiple terms, I urge you to really think about and listen to what Meyer says about his own experience, about what the music meant for him, and how the tone of his statement really challenges the kind of framework that Timmons offers through optimism.
Kurt Meyer now plays as part of his celebration of a free Passover in America, an arrangement of Yiddish folk songs and songs of freedom. Mr. Meyer.
There are thousands of people brought here by the United Service who, just as I, lost their mothers during the Nazi persecution. In memory, I want to play the old familiar song, My Yiddish Mama.
introduction and Meyer's brief statement of loss reveals some aspects of how the crimes of Nazism were described in the post-war period, not only in the theatrical tones of Timmins' announcement, but in the direct comparison between Nazi Europe and America, and in the use of key symbols like Auschwitz to evoke the larger fact of Nazi crimes. In other examples that are in the book, but not in this presentation, symbols like the gas chambers or tattoos often stood as reference for the events that we now understand as the Holocaust, and suggest some of the ways that American Jews at the time understood these stories, even beyond just what was being shared through their communal life. And a few things really stand out to me here. First, we hear directly from Meyer, his voice, his words. And this was not common during this time period when Jewish survivors were largely not yet in the United States and largely not yet able to speak English. Also, this is not a generic story. Meyer is explicit about his own loss and the loss of those that went through this experience with him, in direct contrast to something like the Life magazine's article, Generic Reference to Concentration Camps. This kind of is quite different. While we do not learn anything specific about Meyer's experiences in these various concentration camps, we do hear directly from him about his sense of loss and the terror of Nazism, even as Timmins tries to kind of spin that story into one of optimism. And I think that is pretty common of this time, that there was a motivation to spin these stories towards looking towards the future away from the past. Following Out of the Wilderness, Meyer's story was retold twice for American audiences. First, in a 9-page New Yorker article titled Displaced, and then in a radio adaptation of that article also titled Displaced. The article, written by journalist Daniel Lang, detailed Meyer's life under Nazism, from 1938 until his arrival in New York in 1946. Lang interviewed Meyer upon his 1946 immigration to the United States and framed his story as one of displacement and homecoming. The title, Displaced, much like Out of the Wilderness, suggests this kind of broad narrative, and Lang's opening paragraph positions the article strongly in favor of immigration reform for the United States. The article begins, "One of the oratorical flourishes that almost every politician uses when addressing a group of foreign-born citizens is to hail America as the haven of the oppressed. He tells of the coming of the Pilgrims. In another year or so, the politician will be able to add a modern category, the DPs, or displaced persons." We saw earlier how organizations like the Citizens Committee employed this idea. Holocaust survivors who, after the war, became displaced persons, now in an American context became delayed pilgrims. By referring to DPs as delayed pilgrims, Jewish and other immigration advocacy groups called attention to those still in need of saving and to America's historical imperative to act. This rhetorical strategy did more than align Jewish and American values. It transformed foreign and victimized survivors into Americans. More, Lang's article provided a detailed version of Meyer's experience under Nazism, published in print for national circulation. While Lang is using Meyer's story as representative of the concept of displacement, this is also an example of a detailed narrative. As readers, and readers at that time, would have learned about Meyer's experience of deportation from one camp to another and the details of his experience, not only as one of displacement, but as something closer to what we might today consider Holocaust testimony. Lang tracks Meyer from Karlsbad, Karlovy Vary now, Czechoslovakia, at the moment when the Germans were awarded the Sudetenland of the Munich Accords, and Meyer fled to Prague. Then to his deportation with his mother to Theresienstadt, where they lived for 2.5 years. There, Meyer's mother worked in the women's section, sewing uniforms for the Germans, until she was deported to Auschwitz. Soon after, Meyer was also deported to Auschwitz, where he learned that his mother had been sent directly to the gas chambers. At Auschwitz, we learned through Langer's article that Meyer was assigned to the camp band, avoiding forced labor, but witnessing the lines of victims sent to a gas chamber. Lang quotes Meyer as saying, quote, "The idea was for us to drown out their cries, but we never could." After 2 months at Auschwitz, Meyer was sent to Ohrdruf, a slave labor camp where he worked on a V-2 launching site until he was again assigned to play music. In February 1945, Meyer was sent to Sachsenhausen, where he worked in an underground airplane factory. And a few weeks later, in March, he was forced on a death march to Buchenwald, where in 1945, he was liberated by the Americans. Lang defined Mayer's Holocaust experience for readers of The New Yorker in a much more contemporary style, where there is a chronological progression from ghetto to camp to death march, one that ended in freedom in America. Again, a familiar ending for so many Holocaust survivor testimonies. In the year following Lang's New Yorker article, the Citizens Committee on Displaced Persons dramatized Lang's article, scripting both the interview between Lang and Meyer as well as Meyer's experiences during the Holocaust. The radio drama, also titled Displaced, dramatized Meyer's story to humanize the conceptual category of displaced persons and the contemporary crisis. Much like Lang's article, the radio drama framed the story in advocacy terms, focusing on displacement and the need for reformed immigration policy, while also depicting a Jewish experience under Nazism. I'm going to play 2 clips from Displaced to highlight both of these elements, but let me just set up a few ideas first. Unlike Out of the Wilderness, we do not hear Mayer's voice. Instead, so this is Mayer, this is Academy and Tony Award winning actor Paul Mooney, who played Mayer in the dramatization of Displaced. Mooney was a strong and public advocate for Jewish survivors after the war, serving as a leading fundraiser for many of the campaigns I mentioned earlier. He recorded radio advertisements for the SOS program. He adopted young refugee children through these programs and shared their letters with local newspaper to amplify the voices of survivors and the reach of these programs. He traveled to post-war Europe to bring attention to the needs of survivors. Nonetheless, this raises a really important question for us in terms of Holocaust representation. Whose voice should represent Holocaust survivors? Who has the power and authenticity to tell these stories? And I would say it's an important question that we get to kind of think about and discuss. But at the time, in 1948, this wasn't a question that they were discussing. The power of these stories was meant, again, to activate American Jews and to activate American response to the needs of survivors, so they wouldn't have been asking themselves those questions. Additionally, this story is transformed into an audio story played on the radio. It is not an interview between Lang and Meyer, but a dramatized version of that, which really raises another question, which how does the genre of radio affect the story? How does it change this experience from one of a kind of memory expression into a kind of activism and action-oriented story? Finally, let's all listen for some of the themes we've already identified as prevalent at that time, especially the central place of America as a land of hope and opportunity. The first clip is right from the beginning of the radio broadcast, and we'll be able to hear an actor as Lang here, meeting and talking with Mooney as Mayer, right as Mayer is stepping off the ship in New York. I'm just like a note for you in case this is a little confusing. The radio drama jumps between times, so there's a lot going on kind of in the radio.
Would you tell me, Mr. Meyer, about the first time you thought of coming to America?
Well, I suppose the idea could have begun with the snapshots and postcards of Alice's. I recall back in 1938, I was playing the piano in Hotel Goldener Schild in Carlsbad. That used to be my hometown. I was born there.
You don't want this, do you? It is just an old postcard.
Oh, yes. I want it. I want to take it with me, Mickey.
But it is just a postcard.
I know. But it's for my sister in America. It's a picture of the Empire State Building.
So I think that music will flourish at the end as a reminder that this is from the 1940s and helps us kind of really orient our understanding that the genre of radio from that time was shaping how these narratives were circulating. Let me play a second clip as well. Remember, I noted that Lang's article, unlike so many other examples, detailed Mayer's experience under Nazism and multiple concentration and work camps. This second clip dramatizes one of those experiences, but with a significant narrative change. Lang's article includes a detail about Mayer's time at Ohrdruf, where he was forced to work hard labor. Lang writes in The New Yorker, quote, "One afternoon, when Mayer did not seem to be working fast enough, a guard wearing brass knuckles went to work on him and permanently scarred his chest." The same scene in the radio version transfers the punishment from Mayer to the man next to him. And let's listen. And again, I would encourage you to really think about the accents that are being performed here.
I was given a wheelbarrow and a pick and shovel and a lesson in what was expected of us by the poor fellow next to me. He faltered, and the guard rushed up.
You there, get moving!
Please, I must rest for just a moment.
Get moving!
I can't. I try, but...
You are here to work. If you can't work, you are no use to us. So, you, over there, don't stand there staring at me. Get back to work! There. Now get to work! And all of you!
This gunshot exposes a narrative leap from the article to the radio drama. There is no gunshot at all in the New Yorker article, suggesting it may have been entirely fabricated for radio. It is certainly a more dynamic audio moment, reminding us that this was for a listening audience. But I question what this means for the story, and I argue that this change is just one small example of how Holocaust narratives in the late 1940s were not powerful because of their veracity. These narratives were not meant to document what happened. They were meant to reveal the fear and danger of Mayer's experience, to provoke American listening audiences to understand the terror and violence of Nazism, a different need and a different urgency that I think is communicated well through the genre of radio at the time. I chose to share the multiple representations of Kurt Meyer's story today because it highlights so many of the themes explored in Saving Our Survivors. Primary among them, Kurt's story and its repeated telling challenges the belief that there were no Holocaust narratives in America after the war. In fact, Holocaust survivors, their voices, their narratives, their experiences were widely circulated in post-war America in multiple forms of media for multiple audiences. A radio special, a New Yorker article, a radio drama, and so many others that I highlighted and more in the book. And yet the idea that there was silence after the war remains. The sense that survivors did not share their story publicly, that American Jews weren't listening, remains. Saving Our Survivors explores the burst of expression of Holocaust narratives after the war that are in many ways unfamiliar. But these narratives offer an earlier starting point for understanding the development of Holocaust memory in America and a way for us to better see the gaps in collective engagement with the Holocaust. Transformations, not only in the stories themselves, but in the technologies used to capture and share them. Transformations in the central themes, and in particular in the role survivors play in crafting these narratives, moving from the periphery to the center of how we understand the Holocaust today. Considering these narratives hurts, but also Irene and Charles and the images circulating with fundraising brochures reminds us that these narratives are all historically bound. We are reminded that the narratives we take in now, whether those are from testimony collections, movies, personal interactions with survivors, online videos, VR content, all of these too are historically bound. They are created with the technology available to institutions. They are crafted with care and concern for the pressing issues of the day. Expanding our understanding of the history of Holocaust narrative creation and narrativization can help us better trace the messy, diffuse, and ongoing nature of Holocaust narrative construction, both in the wake of each new tragedy we confront and in the long wake of remembering those tragedies. Thank you so much.
That was fascinating. Those audio clips are quite something to listen to. Okay, so let's open this up now to questions. A reminder that your microphones are turned off and we are taking questions via the Q&A function. And I'm gonna take you up on your offer during your presentation to hear more about the story of Irene and Charles.
Great. It's a great place to start. So Irene and Charles were both about 9 years old after the war, and they were brought to the United States, as I said, by an organization called Rescue Children. Rescue Children sponsored a number of orphan homes in post-war Europe, and they brought Irene and Charles because they were both very beautiful young children. They were literally poster children for this cause. They were brought around, as I mentioned, they were kind of brought to fundraising events. They met the president. They were in the newspaper. The longer story of this is that when Irene and Charles were first brought to the United States, they were both told that they would be brought back to Paris after the war. And Irene has, in the decades since given many testimonies, 3 of which are held at the United States Holocaust Museum, if anybody is interested in listening to them. And she talks about how she wanted to go back to Paris because her plan was to immigrate to Israel with a friend of hers from the orphan home. And instead, the leaders of rescue children, once these children had made it to the United States, felt like they couldn't send children back to the deprivation of Europe after they had seen the kind of like bounty of America. And so they worked to find homes for these children to be adopted into. Irene was adopted to a family named Slotkin on Long Island, and Charles was adopted into a family, and I'm blanking on the last name of the family at the moment, Friedman in Pennsylvania. And the stories of them at that time, like there's a little bit of a record in the archive. Charles invited the heads of rescue children to his bar mitzvah. And so there's a sense that like they were living these full lives. There's 2 really interesting things that I want to follow up on. One, both Irene and Charles were siblings, had siblings, and their adopted families both found and brought their siblings over after long kind of battles with Europe. But what's totally missing from these stories in the post-war period for Irene in particular was that Irene was a Mengele twin. Her and her twin brother Rene had been experimented upon in Auschwitz. And if you were to look at the stories that circulated about her in the press, you would have no way of knowing that history. It was just that she was this like beautiful young child that was paraded around. None of the trauma that she lived through or kind of experienced even afterwards as in the United States without a real sense of support is documented in these stories. Charles also kind of didn't have a great experience. And the long tail of these stories is that Irene eventually became a really public speaker. She spoke a lot. She has all of these testimonies. Her and her twin brother Rene made a documentary film, which comes with like an educational module that people can use in classrooms. And then the kind of record of Charles just went out. I couldn't find any further record of him. Turns out the year the book came out, so last year, I got an email from Charles's son-in-law that he read about my book. He saw that Charles was in it, and his father-in-law had always told them these stories, and they hadn't really believed him that he'd met President Truman. And I was able to send them all of these records showing like, yes, that story happened. And I Zoomed with Charles last year, and it turned out that he didn't want to talk about his Holocaust experience at all. He really wanted to tell me that he'd become a professional tennis player, which I think is amazing. And Irene, I think, had taken a really different tact. And then in the 1990s, Life magazine did a follow-up article on Irene and Charles. And they brought them back together, and they both reflect on their experience in Life magazine from the 1940s. And Charles remembers it being really fun. He remembers all the food and the clothes. And Irene remembers it being horrible, that she didn't know anyone. She was forced to change in these like into these clothes in like an open dressing room. It was like adding to the trauma. And she has these terrible memories of it, while Charles like remembers it as this like fun adventure. And so I think this longer story, first of all, is just very interesting. I think the paths that Holocaust survivors take over their lives is fascinating and really offers a lot of insight into the way these experiences shape people, but also how minimal the stories in the 1940s were, that none of this rich information, none of the experiences were reflected there at all.
Well, so that actually brings us interestingly to the second question that I'll read that we received was how long after the war did the discourse broaden to include images of concentration camps? And, you know, what you just said was basically, you know, tailoring the story in order to fit what was necessary in the moment, right?
Yeah.
And this is asking that same question. When did all of that start coming out? Sort of the raw information. Yeah.
So I know I mentioned kind of briefly at the end that there were these kinds of like symbols that a lot of the communal narratives would say, like, this person was in Auschwitz or this person had a tattoo. And they were relying on the fact that American Jews already knew what that meant, which suggests that these narratives and these images in particular were already circulating. And I want to really highlight one particular way that they were already circulating even before the war ended, which was through the propaganda of the US military itself. And so the US military in the 1940s, and like once they entered World War II, were bringing units with the liberating armies with photographers and film in particular. And so they were then creating short films that were aired before movies in every movie theater across the country. And many of them were with kind of tagging along with the liberating army. So the images, not just of kind of emaciated concentration camp victims, but also of not the gas chambers, but of the kind of mechanism of concentration camps was circulating in America. Eisenhower kind of famously brought locals to view the concentration camp at Dachau and to view the kind of horrors that were happening there, and those images circulated in the American press. And so Jewish communal organizations didn't necessarily need to be the venue for circulating images of concentration camps because those were circulating through American mainstream media and narratives. I would love to hear if that question is more about like when did a more like contemporary narrative, if the question is about when did a more contemporary narrative of Holocaust survivors kind of on this trajectory from their homes to a ghetto, to deportation, to a concentration camp, I think that starts to take shape in the late mid 1970s when testimony projects start to get created and survivors start to create a framework for understanding their experience within a broader historical experience. But that's not to say it didn't happen, right? Because Kurt Mayer's story in 1947 is already being told kind of along that trajectory.
Right. And since you brought up Kurt Mayer, I'm curious if you could expand a little bit on, you mentioned to us to listen closely to the accents used. If you can maybe expand a little bit on the accents and what your interpretation is.
It was one of the things that kind of first drew me to the kind of richness of these radio broadcasts, other than just that they are so not what you would expect to hear about a Holocaust survivor story. They're like at the musical flourishes in particular. You're like, what is happening? Why is this what we're listening to? But it, this was not the only example. So this was happening, and this was kind of the genre norm at the time. I think what's compelling to me about the accents is that when we listen to Mayer himself, like in Out of the Wilderness, he has an accent, but it's not heightened. I think it's kind of like a European cosmopolitan accent, I would say. I don't know. And then by the time Mooney is kind of performing as Mayer, he has this like bigger, broader accent. And then in that scene, the biggest accent of all is the German guard with like this very dramatic, like over the top, villainous accent. And I think it just kind of highlights and underscores the way these narratives were creating roles for these different participants to take. It wasn't that Mayer in the dramatization was meant to be a real person, even though he was representing a real person, but he was the character of a Holocaust survivor, and the Nazi guard was a character of a villain. Whereas when we listen to Mayer himself, he is a real person. So I think that the accents help to kind of highlight that.
And where do you think that falls in with sort of the evoking emotions that you were talking about, and feelings? Do you have evidence that was successful at the time?
I have been asked this question repeatedly, like, what is my evidence that this was successful? The evidence that this was successful was that these organizations raised hundreds of millions of dollars year over year over year. And I didn't get into this, but in the campaign in 1946, the Jewish leaders of UJA are asking American Jews across the country, like, this is a one-time gift. Give as much as you can. We're going to solve this in 1 year. And then they clearly do not solve it in 1 year. And then they have to go back to everyone in 1947 and say, well, now you need to give more than you gave at this one-time gift level last year. And so I don't have direct evidence that someone listened to Kurt Mayer's radio broadcast and then sent in money, or like called their congressman, right? I don't have that direct evidence, but I think the persistence of how much funding UJA was able to raise, and it's not just UJA, like Hadassah also raises more than they'd ever raised before. Other organizations like the Jewish Labor Committee also raises like more than they've ever raised before. I think that kind of ability of these organizations to raise the level, not only of the amount they raise, but the number of people that are giving gifts. It's clear that the awareness and urgency is being communicated through all of these different channels.
Okay. A bit of a follow-up question from somebody in the audience. When or why did public media interest wane in learning about the Holocaust? So this individual's recollection, which might be inaccurate, they admit, is that the Holocaust didn't really start to be talked about again outside of Jewish circles until after the NBC miniseries The Holocaust aired.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
So there's like a lot of, I think, components, like a lot of ways we could kind of unpack that question. One is that the laws around how much airtime public radio needed to include for public service changed during this time. And so there's like a very like radio legal answer that I think is part of the overall story. I want to give maybe a different story, which is that towards the end of my book, I start to talk about the UJA campaigns into the 1950s. And the reason I want to kind of highlight that is because by the 1950s, most Jewish survivors had left the displaced persons camps. They had either gone to Israel or to the United States or to Canada or to Australia. There's a group of Jews that remain in deplete camps, and there's been really good scholarship about them. So I'm not ignoring them, but for the purposes of this story, let's not focus on them. So the majority of the Jewish aid from America is now being routed not to Europe, but to Israel and to North Africa in particular, and the need of North African Jews to get out of North Africa. And so what happens is that the narratives in Jewish communal circulation and in the fundraising campaigns start to focus on the Jews of, Morocco, for example. And even within the Jewish circles, the narratives are moving a little bit away from the Holocaust survivors specifically. But one of the things that I found was that the symbols of the Holocaust are still resonating, even while they start to focus on the Jews of Morocco or other places. So they're still in the 1943 UJA fundraising film, they zoom in on a young girl with a tattoo, even though the majority of the campaign is about the Jews of Morocco. And so there's this really interesting way where the symbols of this time period and the symbols that are successful for fundraising at this time period continue to echo and resonate, even while the shift of where the people are in most need moves away from European centers.
Interesting. Couple of other questions. Did Jewish GIs who liberated the camp help disseminate the plight of the Jews?
Yeah, great question. So the answer is definitely yes. One of the reasons I ended up naming the book Saving Our Survivors was there's this really interesting conversation and a really wonderful fundraising speech in 1947 about like the hour, like who are these people to us? And one of the things they talk about a lot is that for many Jewish Americans, the hour is actually our family. And so the GIs are writing to their families. They are writing to their synagogues. They're trying to help make connections. They're trying to find people. Someone from their synagogue would write to the GI and say, hey, can you go find my relative? One of the ways I think the GI story intersects most directly with the kind of institutional story that I'm telling is the Saving Our Survivors program, which was a JDC program. So that program started because GIs were writing home and telling their family members, hey, I'm in this DP camp and these people need layettes, these people need food, these people need, and so it started as this really like one-to-one kind of campaign where American Jewish women largely were working within their social networks, sending material to their sons who were GIs or their rabbis who were chaplains. It was often like a rabbi program. And then it kind of grew. JDC saw like, okay, the scale of this one-to-one isn't quite meeting the need. And what happens when we jump in and we add some institutional heft to it? But that GI piece was absolutely circulating, not just narratives, but really circulating need because they wanted to respond to what they saw.
Okay. Before we get to another question, I just want to put out there if you can remind people or let people know how they can get the book.
Yeah.
And I think you have a discount code as well from the publisher you can
I have a
share.
discount code and a website from Indiana University Press. But there's also, if it's easier or you're more inclined, there's a sale on all social science books at Amazon. And so you're able to purchase the book from there as well on sale.
Great.
Um,
Great. Thank you.
so either way.
All right. Do you have any idea roughly how many Jews were in the DP camps that initially made it to the U.S. or to Israel? How that breakdown?
Yeah, the numbers are very fuzzy. And so I do list some
It's a
numbers in the
transitory
book.
group, right? I mean,
Yes.
it's so.
I do list some numbers in the book, largely taken from like earlier studies. I didn't do any demographic work, but I would say that the numbers are really challenging, particularly because some of the issues I raised at the beginning, which is that, you know, some Jewish survivors would register their name in one DP camp and then they would smuggle themselves into a different DP camp and register there because that was the way that the organizations were circulating survivor lists so people could find relatives. So there were people who were like registered multiple times. People used fake names to register through, they like smuggled themselves in. People were kind of getting transport back home and then seeing if they could find family and then come back. So there was a really kind of loose population of displaced persons. I don't have great numbers.
Okay. No, that's understandable. Did the same organizations that mobilized donations also sponsor survivors to come to the United States?
So sort of. So like JDC was the let's just use JDC as an example. They were focused on humanitarian aid in Europe. They were not sponsoring people to come to the United States. In 1948, JDC also started then redirecting some of their attention to Israel. But before that, they had not been focused on Israel. They were really focused on rebuilding communities in Europe. United Palestine Appeal was raising lots of money. They were really focused on getting people to Israel. So different organizations had a different focus. Organizations like the National Refugee Service, which became the United Service for New Americans, which became HIAS after several merges, they were focused on welcoming Jews into the United States when they were able to come. The laws of how people got to the United States at this time period kept changing. It's a really short period of time, but there was so much uncertainty and change that some of them needed organizational sponsors, some of them didn't need organizational sponsors. It wasn't the same as during the war when individuals absolutely needed an individual sponsor to financially vouch for them. So as these rules were changing, the sponsors was different. So what was happening organizationally was that organizations in Europe were helping Jews get to places where they could emigrate from. So like JDC administered DP camps in Italy. Why in Italy? Well, they were like learning how to build boats. They were learning how to like do things that they could do and then leave from Italy to go to Israel. JDC was sponsoring camps in Germany where they would take the boat out of Bremen and come to the United States. So they were supporting that process, but they weren't involved in the sponsoring part.
Right. And just to clarify then, with JDC, yes, working closely with other organizations such as HIAS and predecessors, right, in terms of making sure, and this, yes, not sponsoring to necessarily emigrate, but supporting that emigration when needed, right? So providing
and hiring the social workers who are working with the survivors to fill out the forms that would allow them, right? So the term sponsoring, I think, is a little complicated, but these organizations were all working in tandem and just trying to kind of fill the holes that were necessary to get people where they wanted to go. Sometimes, not always.
Absolutely. Okay, well, this has been really great. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, Rachel. I think we've all learned quite a bit. And those audio clips are going to stick with me for a while. So I hope everybody else found our program today interesting, and I thank you all for joining us. Our next webinar is going to take place on June 1st, and it's Konstantin Tkachuk, who is the recipient of the 2025 Ruth and David Musher JDC Archives Fellowship, will be giving a lecture on the travel of Israel Friedlander and Bernard Cantor in Ukraine, insights from the JDC Archives. You're able to register for that on our website under programs or our social media. And please feel free to sign up for our e-newsletter on our website if you would like to be added to our mailing list for upcoming public programs. Thank you once again, and it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.